So we're going to talk about the different phases and how we currently, for the last year and a half, have been setting up these currencies. And the first step that we do in going into a community is a baseline, a setup kind of phase. We'll call that phase one, in which we go in and we basically identify the productive capacity of that community, and we do that in a few different ways. We do a lot of resource mapping to understand kind of the politics of the local community, how power flows in that community, and we also look at how people are consuming and purchasing and being employed, and basically try to sketch out what are the loops existing in that community already that could be sort of detached from the national currency system. So in other words, we want to be able to say, okay, this woman, she sends her kids to this school, and these school teachers are buying what locally, and from whom do they buy locally, and then what do those people buy? Let's say they're selling tomatoes. Where do they get their tomatoes? Maybe from the farmers. What do the farmers then need? More school fees. So that might be one loop that we can look at. And so that's one reason we tend to start with schools quite a bit in looking at these communities. But we do a large baseline analysis. Even before doing that baseline, we do a lot of conversations with the community, and we usually identify a cooperative or a self-help group or some sort of group that already exists in that community that's already doing some sort of communal work. In a way, we want to see these currencies as a commons, right? So we want to deal with organizations that already have a sense of commons to them. We've worked, for instance, in communities that are being assisted by Red Cross to develop community farms, for instance. And so we can go into programs that are a few years old, that are looking like they need a transition out of a donor-funded model and into something more sustainable. And so what we do is, in terms of the baseline, is there's a lot of questions here, and I think it'll be available as part of the course. You can look through what are all the questions we ask. We customize that survey to look at things like food security and what's important to that community, and what are they going to be spending the most on, and what are those different loops that the currencies are going to be able to flow in, and where are the gaps, where are the industries or imports that could be created locally. And so as an example, this community that we were working with the Red Cross, they were lacking maize milling. They were traveling an hour or two to take their corn or their maize and go have it ground into a flour. And so we worked with a cooperative there that wanted and already had space to set up a maize mill operation. So we bought the machine and we installed the power with them, and basically we came in as sort of a capacity builder for those assets, and in a sense invested in that community and said, okay, look, how much are we going to increase the profits of this cooperative? How much are we going to increase the productive capacity of this cooperative? And let's create a currency based on at least a fraction of that increase. So if we're increasing their profits by 50%, and let's say that ends up being $10 worth a month, can we take that $10 and say, okay, let's create $60 worth of community currency as a beginning amount in that community? And that's what we did. So that $60 was just to say, okay, over this next harvest season, this is a fraction of the profits that are going to come out of that increased capacity in that cooperative that we've helped capacity build. In some communities, you'll find that you don't need to do any capacity building. Really, it's already there, and you just need to organize it together. So the very first step is this baseline, understanding what's going on in the community. The second stage, again, is going back and saying, what are those social enterprises or businesses that we can help develop in that community? And can we really make sure that they're functional? Because a big problem in a lot of communities we go to is that they're really lacking basic accounting skills and basic process flows and understanding of supply chains and being able to just track orders. And so we do a lot of capacity building around that. then we pilot it, right? So we issue an initial small amount of currency based on that business, and that initial amount of currency goes out to those businesses that are part of the cooperative, or at least are near the existing business, the cooperative business, and we make sure that there's already a path for the currency to flow. So in other words, the currency goes in to an existing cycle that's already there in the community, and it's trying to sort of lock that cycle in place, right? So in the past, you would have the national currency coming in, you would see that cycle in the community happen, and you would have that the national currency go back out. And if there wasn't currency coming in, that cycle would just stop. So what we're trying to do is say, okay, let's go in and take over 10% of that cycle, right? So that, yes, national currency is still going to affect it, but even when the national currency is not there, that small amount of community currency is going to enable that small cycle to flow, like the one I mentioned with the school system. So that's essentially the idea of the pilot phase. You get things going, you also involve the local chief and local administration, and you basically show people this is what's going on, this is a voucher. Today we always label these things as vouchers. We say they're a voucher for the goods and services of this cooperative. And that's super important because it gives them a sense of, oh, we've seen vouchers before. This is nothing but a circulating voucher. And it's actually backed by something. And so that's helped us on the governmental side quite a lot to be able to just say that. We're not creating a currency, we're creating a proxy for goods and services in the community, and for them to move around. And then once that's been going, once you've really tested that, that this is the third phase, this pilot phase, once you've really seen that that's going, and you also see that there's excess capacity, right? We haven't really created a currency for the total capacity. We've just created a small little portion of it to make sure that people understand it and it moves. Then we tell all those initial pilot people to go find another 10, 20 people themselves to bring into the network, and we do a big launch. And usually that's, when we say launch, we're talking about something that's very public. Usually, we want to have banners and music and marches and the administration there, and if we can get the TV people there, if we can get the police there, that's great. And so we always really invite all those people there so that they don't arrest us later. They knew about it. It was very over the table. We weren't trying to hide anything, and the total amount printed is done very publicly, and that's super important. At that stage, at the launch stage, it means you've already done a lot of, you've already printed the vouchers, and voucher printing or currency printing is, one, it's expensive to get really good high quality like security notes that can't be copied easily, and it's also really time consuming and energy consuming to keep that currency like in a proper vault. Once it's out in the field or it's at a field office, that unallocated stuff, if it's just sitting there, if it gets stolen or whatever, you've kind of lost the value of your currency all of a sudden. So, as a goal, we try to print as little as possible and make sure it's all in circulation as fast as possible. So there's none sitting in a vault waiting for something to happen. It's in the community actually doing something useful. And we're rapidly trying to move into digital currencies as fast as possible. And it looks, the technology and the mobile phones right now in Kenya are at the stage where it's getting to be the case. There's enough smartphones and whatnot to get that to happen. So if you have an option to go digital, I would highly recommend that. Although, we've done a lot with the paper currencies, and I don't think that they're worth trying. So the last phase is basically what is our long-term commitment to that community. And I usually tell people when they say, oh, I want to start a currency, I say, well, it's kind of like having a baby. Like, you don't get to not have that currency again. Like, once you give birth to a currency, it's kind of your baby. You're gonna be part of that community for a very, very, very long time. If you want that currency to really thrive and work well, you can't just start it and walk away. And so what we do over the years following that launch is that we have people going to that community on a fairly regular basis, And one thing that we're doing is, we're sort of, in a way, you're sort of acting as a central bank. You're saying, okay, well, you've created a certain amount of currency based on this productive capacity in the community. Well, how's that going? Is the amount of currency over time, so you've issued the currency and it's, you have this much in the community, and so much of it every month is coming back into, say, the cooperative, and then it's being reissued, and we'll get into how it's reissued into the community, like through operating expenses and community service. And it comes back into the community, and then it drops back down again into the cooperative. And what does that cycle look like? How deep are those troughs? Like for how long does it that there's no currency in the system? And these are the kinds of questions where you say, okay, what do we want to see? We want to see some regular flows going through that community. We don't want to see all the currency go back into the cooperative and just sit there for a week, and then it all goes back out, and it only stays out in existence for a day, and people just bring it back into the cooperative. You want to see it circulating. And so what does that look like? And so that's a lot of what we do, especially even for the first year after the launch, is making sure that people understand how it works, that there's branding in the community, that people know that when they get these vouchers, they can use them here, here, here. And there's no question about that. And so that's really important. And then the sense of local ownership is probably like the most crucial thing, because as long as you as whatever you are, an NGO, if you're an outsider of that community, it's always going to be your currency. It's never going to be their currency unless they really have a sense of owning it and really self-identifying that this is based on our goods and services. It's part of our local identity. And so that kind of brings us to the end of what would be sort of like phase 4. So at the end of phase 4, after you've done your launch, and it's probably even like 6 months to a year after that launch, the community is basically functioning, it's working well. What we do is, on the vouchers themselves, we put in expiration date. And the reason we do that is because we want the community not to save them for one. We want them to really see this as a spending currency versus the national currency is their savings currency. And we want them to really understand that, we use the term like, if you keep this in your pocket, it's going to actually burn it. We really want to spend it as fast as possible. And so the expiration date gives them that sense. This isn't a savings tool. It's a really mobility tool. And and so on each bill, there's like these places where we can put a sticker, or we put a stamp, or we write the next year. So if it expires this year, we go to the next little section and say, okay, now it's renewed, and it expires the next year. So we do these renewal events. Communities can do these themselves, but generally we come in and help with these renewal events. And part of it is also printing excess or more currency, because usually by even the middle of the year of the first launch year, or the end of that year, they've already identified a lot more potential capacity. And ideally, that not only the productive capacity of the cooperative, but also the productive capacity of the rest of the businesses in the network are sort of part of that collateral for these currencies. And so there's really room to create more and more currencies. So we start with a small amount. We want to see them circulating as fast as possible, but over time, we want there to be enough of them to really target at minimum 10% of the circulation of trade in that community. I mean, one analogy I like to give around the amount that's really needed in the community is that if we had $1 worth of community currency and it was moving fast enough, if it was moving at the speed of light, it could really cancel all trade that was ever in existence, right? And so it's not so much about the amount, it's about having efficient markets, that these systems are really moving amongst each other, and that the efficiency of the markets in villages or in informal settlements is really bad generally. I mean, generally around the entire world, people don't always know that their neighbor could do that thing. They go to the hardware store to buy a wrench when they could have borrowed one from their next door neighbor, and things like that. I mean, there's all sorts of, even in business supply chains, they don't realize that their businesses could be a lot more efficient. And so part of the currency is about advertising and getting people to be aware of their own capacity and their own self-sufficiency, so that these markets really gel and move faster. And so again, it's not about increasing the supply too much. I like the idea of targeting something like 10% of the trade in the community over time, but starting with the collateral based on these social enterprises that we're working with in phase 2. And then finally, phase 5 is that cycle sort of on a yearly basis. So we come back every year. We look at renewals. If the community needs help, we generally have people that can come and do more trainings with the communities. We try to do a yearly survey in the community that is based on the baseline we did at the very first stage, so that we can say what are the changes in that community over time. What are they doing with the currency? Is it affecting trust in the community? Is it affecting politics? Is it affecting trade? And how is it affecting trade in the community? And so it's really important to bring in as much research as you can, because these systems are really new and there's very little data on how they're working. And the actual movement of these currencies is a really amazing sort of transparency tool for how communities interact with each other. So there's a lot of really interesting and good data there for understanding how we as humans do interact with each other, and how to sort of think toward the next level of those things. Because ideally, a lot of these flows that we're trying to capture in the local currency are flows that we should be able to systematize even to a further extent, in the sense of how hard is it to systematize the food going from the farmer to people's mouths in those communities. In other words, like there's really no need to have full-on market economies when you have extremely efficient flows of services like bringing food to people's mouths. So that's a brief summary of 5 phases of developing a local currency and how we've set up at least the paper-based Sarafu credit models in Kenya.